Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Secret Resume podcast, hosted by me, Melody Moore. In this podcast, we explore the people, places, and experiences that have shaped my guests, those which have influenced who they are as people and where they are in their work life today. You can listen in as we have a rich exploration of often unexamined and undiscussed, but very important aspects of their lives, or as I like to call it, their secret resume. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to advise listeners that it contains sensitive subjects, including discussion of childhood abuse. So my guest today is Jane Hatton. Jane, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today. You have got a great story. So Jane, can you just start off by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Melody, and I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, it sounds bizarre to say what I'm about to say, but I am the CEO of the only global social enterprise and global disability job board that is run by and for disabled people. It's a global social enterprise that I founded 13 years ago. I'm also a traveller and a grandmother and all sorts of things. I live in London, none of which I ever expected to happen.
And we're going to talk a lot more about how you got there in the next hour, probably. So let's jump right back, shall we, to the beginning, to your childhood and some of the things that went on there that really are still, having an impact and are influencing you today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think my childhood was necessarily remarkable compared to, anybody else's. I was very lucky, privileged. I lived in a nice leafy suburb in the West Midlands, went to a nice school. I was an only child, but I lived in a road where there were lots of other families. So I had lots of friends that were very, very local next door and just down the road. And of course, this is in the 60s, so there wasn't much parental supervision. He just went round each other's houses and he disappeared off for the day and came back when the streetlights came on. I had a really wonderful mother. She was a bit of a pioneer, really. So she was a social worker and she was a qualified social worker. And there were very, very few qualified social workers in those days. So she was a bit of a pioneer in her own way. My father was an industrialist, quite successful, not such a nice person. He was actually quite an abusive father in many ways. But I think, like a lot of families in those days, he was largely not really there. So he would kind of be out at work during the day. He'd come home, we'd have dinner, and then he'd sit behind his newspaper or watching the television. So he wasn't really a very present figure in my life, I'm very grateful to say, because when he was, it wasn't pleasant. He had a very unpredictable temper. Could be quite violent, not necessarily, I wouldn't say he hit me a lot but, there was a violence there that I was always frightened of him. I remember always being frightened of him, never knowing when he was going to, go into a rage or whatever. And he was occasionally sexually abusive as well. And that makes the whole childhood sound horrific. And it really wasn't, because my mother was kind of a counter to that. Whereas he would tell me I was a disappointment and I was fat and ugly and stupid and all of those things. She was very much the opposite. She never defied him or stood up to him, but she was obviously with me a lot more than he was. And she thought the sun shone out of me. She thought I was amazing. And I felt very loved and secure with her. And so I would say it was a fairly unremarkable, but largely happy childhood, with some episodes of fear intermingled with that. And I don't know if that was what started my brain. You know how children go through that it's not fair stage where fairness is a really important thing. I kind of got there and stuck there, and I've never really grown out of that kind of developmental stage. And I was really conscious about fairness, and whether that was because I didn't feel the way I was treated was fair. I don't think it was that, because at the time I didn't realize it was unusual. I assumed every family was like mine. I didn't question it. And I don't remember this happening, but I remember my mother telling me about, there was a time when I was about 8, I think, and I loved school. I loved junior school, as we called it then. It was a way of getting away from home. It meant I had friends. I liked the teachers. It was a really lovely local state, primary school. And I suddenly stopped wanting to go and didn't really vocalize why. I would just say, I can't go to school today because I feel sick. And I remember my father getting incredibly angry because he recognized that obviously I wasn't ill. There was some reason why I wasn't going. So he would shake me and, get really quite strict. But eventually, my mother apparently got it out of me that I was outraged that the children who had free school meals had to queue up in a different queue to those of us that didn't have free school meals. And in my sort of 8-year-old innocence, it's not fair kind of stage, I was absolutely outraged at this. Why would we have two separate queues? Why would we all have to know who had free school meals and who didn't? It just seemed awful. And so my mother listened to me say this, and I found it really quite hard to verbalize to her, I think, but she took me to the head teacher and said, look, is this going on? Is this a problem? This is really upsetting, Jane. And they changed the system. So what they did was they gave the children who had free school meals tokens, and we had money, and we all queued up in the same line and paid for our school meals in the same way as each other. And I didn't know who'd got coins and who'd got tokens. And so it kind of changed the system. And I don't actually remember that happening. I remember the not wanting to go to school. And I remember my father shaking me, so hard I had to clamp my jaws together so my teeth didn't crash into each other. But apparently that was something that I was really outraged by. And it doesn't surprise me because I do get very wound up by injustice or things that I perceive as injustice. And so that's kind of been a bit of a theme looking back that's gone throughout my life. Although it wasn't an intentional one, it kind of fell into that realm. And it's often, I think, only when you look back over your life that things start making sense and you can see the pattern of them. At the time, it's all very random and doesn't seem to make any sense at all. But that absolute outrage at unjustified injustice is something that has never left me. And I'm certainly not alone in that,
So you weren't having free school meals. It was other people. No. It wasn't that you were the one who was experiencing.
No, absolutely not. No, my family were relatively well off in the area. We lived in a nice house. We had a car. We went on holidays. I didn't have free school meals, but I just felt it was outrageous that we should be segregated by who had free school meals and who didn't. It just seemed why would you do that? Why is it necessary for anybody to be judged on anything as ridiculous as how much money your parents got? It just seemed unjustifiable and outrageous to me.
So there was I was going to say teenage activist. You weren't even that. You were an 8-year-old activist, Jane.
Yes. Who knew?
And do you think there's any sense of, a sort of anger at some of what was happening to you at home, maybe being, thinking, and therefore spotting unjust things in others?
I think it could well be that, because there were certainly times when I felt that I was unjustifiably being punished for something that wasn't my fault. So, just really stupid things like when my father occasionally would make an effort to try and be a good, he was not all bad. Nobody's all good or all bad. And yeah, you can go back and say, well, was he wanted as a child? And maybe not, but that never justifies abusing a child. But he would do things like he'd say, oh, come and help me in the garden, which seems like quite a nice thing for a father to say to a daughter. And I would freeze in terror because I would know that at the moment he's in a good mood. But at some point I'm going to do something wrong and it will all change. Mm-hmm. And it would be something like we would go into the garden and he would say to me, and I might be 5 or 6, and he'd say, go and get the secateurs from the shed. I have no idea what secateurs are. So I've got 2 choices. I've either got to say, what are they? And immediately I'm stupid and every other child would know, and why don't I know these things? Or I'm going to have to go to the shed and guess which of all the implements in there are secateurs, and hope against hope that I guess right. Because if I don't guess right and I take the wrong thing back to him, then I'm going to have and so inevitably at some point I would do something wrong. And he would get down to my level. He'd put his face right in front of my face, like a few inches away from my nose. And his face would go purple with rage. And I'd kind of back away, and he would come forward as I was backing away. And it's only so far you can back away until you come against a wall or a hedge or something. And then I would be pinned there, and he would be either shouting or, worse, whispering for what felt like hours. It was probably not. It was probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours, about how stupid I was, how every other child in the road would have known what that was, or whatever it was that I'd done wrong, what a disappointment I was, all of those things. And part of me believed him. Obviously, he's the grown up, so he must be right, because I'm only 5. What do I know? And he's telling me I'm stupid or ugly or fat or, whatever it was. Of course, he's right, because he's a grown up. But I think there was a kernel of something inside me that thought, actually, this isn't fair. I'm not deliberately doing these things that you're accusing me of. In fact, I'm doing everything I can to avoid doing these things because I know what the consequences are. And I think although part of me believed him, which was obviously harmful, because you start thinking, well, I am stupid, I am fat, I am ugly, I am all of those things he said. But there was another part that said, this isn't fair, because if I am ugly, I can't help being ugly. If I am stupid, I can't help being stupid. And yet you're punishing me for these things. And yeah, so whether that, well, I don't know. It's easy to go back and justify things and put things in place, but I suppose I'll never really know what that was all about. And to be fair, my mother was also very, because she was a social worker, she was also very interested in fairness. And in some bizarre ways, so was my father, because I remember he was a managing director of a factory. And he was, in the 60s, there was a lot of racism around, racism was the norm. And he wasn't anti-racist, but he was colourblind, which was actually quite a good thing to be, as opposed to being racist. So he just didn't notice people's colour. And his expectations of me as a daughter weren't, oh, well, you're a girl, so you'll get married and you'll be looked after. He had really high expectations of me. And, as a teenager, he had lots of opinions on what were proper jobs and what weren't proper jobs, and what I should do. And he really wanted me to go into engineering, which we'll talk about later. I did do for a short while. And so he wasn't, he had that women should also have careers. He married a woman who was unusually, in those days, qualified with a degree and doing a profession. And he wasn't, well, he probably was threatened by that, but he married her nevertheless. And he had high expectations of me as a girl having a career. And he was colourblind. So I think in his defence, he had a lot of fairness around race and gender and things like that. So, and he was also a very, very good businessman. So he was a good role model in lots of ways. But like all of us, he had flaws. So did I get, I don't know. I don't know where I got that fairness thing from, but it's been deeply ingrained. And I know it is in a lot of, people I talk to and certainly people I work with now, often who have also had very difficult childhoods. Mm-hmm. So whether that is something that's relevant or just coincidental, I'm not qualified to say really, but yeah, it is what it is.
And he had quite an influence in terms of, and you mentioned the engineering there, but you wanted to be a I can't even say the word, musician.
Yes.
Didn't you? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I loved music. I've always loved music. And in junior school, we were allowed to play the recorder, that awful, horrible instrument when it's played badly. And those of us who showed any promise at the recorder, they started, it was in the, I don't know, it must have been 1968. So we're going back a very, very long time. They just started looking at peripatetic music lessons. And we had a teacher come into our school who taught either the violin or the cello. And the teachers approached those of us who'd shown a little bit of promise with the recorder and said, would you be interested in doing these lessons, which were free in those days? And I firmly believe they still should be so. And so I chose the violin purely because it was lighter to carry around than a cello. I had no particular love for the instrument, but I was keen to play a musical instrument. Those were the two on offer. This was the lighter one of the two. And I loved it. I don't think I was exceptionally gifted, but I loved playing the violin, and I played in youth orchestras. And then the borough where I lived had amalgamated with other boroughs, and there was a bigger youth orchestra. And I really loved it. It was for all sorts of reasons. I think music speaks to part of you that you can't put into words. And I just felt that making music with other people was magical. And it was very social. So the people in the orchestras that I played in became, in some cases, lifelong friends. And it was an escape from home. It was escape from school. It was something that was just for me. And I wasn't particularly gifted, so I had to work hard at it. And that meant that if I went to an orchestra rehearsal while I was there, all I could think about was the notes, because I hadn't got any spare capacity to think about what I was going home to, what was going on or anything else in my life, good or bad. I was just completely absorbed. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. I just loved it. I didn't have high ambitions. I just thought I'd love to play in a professional orchestra, even if I'm just on, in the second violins at the back, no soloist, no particular spotlight. I just love to do this. And so I took music O level, and those days there were O levels, and started doing music A level with my thought was I'm going to go to university, study music, and then I'll go to some provincial orchestra, and that would be my life, and that would be fantastic. And I'd gone through the usual childhood things of wanting to be a ballerina, or a tightrope walker at a circus, or I was never particularly graceful, so that was never going to happen. Then a vet, and then you go through those phases. But this was obviously seriously what I wanted to do, and I was doing the qualifications with a view to going to university to do music. And he wanted me to go to university. He thought that was a good thing to do. He'd never gone to university, but he'd gone to evening class and things and learned how to be a draftsman when he came back from the war and all that kind of stuff. So he was very pro-education. And so that was it. I was in my amateur youth orchestras. I was studying A levels. I was learning the violin. I then started learning the flute and the piano. So I had other instruments. And then he was in one of his, occasional rages saying, "What are you messing about at? What are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "Well, I want to play in an orchestra." And he said, "That's not a proper job. And anyway, you're not talented enough. You're not good enough." Because I'd been conditioned, I think, all of my life by him that I was not good enough, because anything I do was never good. I remember in the second year of secondary school, coming second in the whole year in English, which was a big deal. There was about 100 kids in each year. It was a big, grammar school. I can remember him railing at me for ages about why I'd not come first. And I just thought, whatever I do isn't good enough. And so he said, "You're not good enough to be a professional musician. It's all right to have as a hobby, but you'll never be good enough." And I believed him. And also because I had this kind of low self-esteem, I could look around other people in the amateur orchestras that I was playing in, and so many of them, of course, were so much better than me. So obviously what he said was true. Looking back, I don't know if I would have been good enough to play in a second violin section in a provincial orchestra. I like to think I would have been, but it became not an option. And that was pretty dramatic, because by this time I'm 17, halfway through A levels, and there is no plan B. It was never, well, if I can't do this, I'll do something else. That was what I was going to do. That was what I did. And there was no plan B. So I was absolutely floundering. What do I do then? So there's no point in me continuing doing these A levels, which were all geared towards me going to university to do music. So there's no point in continuing with these A levels. But there's a big void. What do I do now? It's a bit of a theme, actually, the what do I do now, looking back. And so he told me to go to do business studies at college, because then I could get a proper job.
Jane, did he prevent you from doing music? Did he say you are not allowed to?
No.
It was more you're not good enough.
He told me I wasn't good enough, and I believed him.
Yeah.
And things like playing in an orchestra isn't a proper job. You need to have a proper job. You need to have a secure job. Part of it might have been motivated by his concern that I would have a secure life. I'm not saying it was all bad, but I just think if he felt that I wasn't good enough, he was probably trying to prevent me from being disappointed when I didn't get a job in an orchestra. And then what would I've got a music degree and nothing to do with it. So it was probably out of, in a sense, misplaced concern. for me, but in his eyes, it wasn't a proper job. And so I should be doing a proper job. And also, a lot of his ego was reflected on external, how he looked. So I think also a big part of that was he wanted a daughter he could be proud of. He didn't have the self-awareness, and I didn't have the knowledge then to recognise that he would never have a daughter he was proud of. Not because of the daughter, but because whatever they did was never going to be good enough. Because if they did do something that was good enough, they would then be a threat to his ego. So it wasn't a battle I could ever win under any circumstances. But of course, at 17, you haven't dissected all that. So yeah, he convinced me that I didn't believe that it wasn't a proper job, but I did believe that I wasn't good enough to do it. So I just flailed around, what the hell am I going to do now? So there was a local college that had a business studies course, so I enrolled for that for a year. It was a 2-year course. I was desperately unhappy because I didn't enjoy any of the subjects that we would. Ironic, because I now run a business. But I didn't enjoy any of the subjects. We did statistics and economy and all sorts of stuff, economics and stuff. And business studies, I just wasn't interested and was desperately, desperately unhappy, both at home and at college. Because by this time, the abuse had stopped. It's stopped when I was about 13, as in the sexual abuse, but the tempers were still there and the putting down was still there. And I was terrifically unhappy at home. We'd also moved to a street which was quite isolated. So instead of being in this lovely little road where everybody had gone to the same local state school and we were all in and out of each other's houses, and it was like having brothers and sisters, but better because you could get away from them. From the age of 13, we moved into this road of beautiful, beautiful houses with no public transport, not able to get to my friends at school. Couldn't really relate to the friends who lived in the road where I lived because they lived different lives. They all went to private school. They had straw boaters and stripy blazers. They all had ponies. Their parents drove, their mothers drove Jensen Interceptors. It was just a different world that I didn't fit in. And I sort of did feel quite isolated because my friends at school and then at college didn't live that life. So I didn't really fit in with them either. I was a bit of a outsider because I was the kind of rich kid in my school and college environment, but then I was the poor relation in my street. So I didn't, it was a difficult time. I was envious of my friends who got ponies and then realized that was ridiculous because nobody at my school had a pony. So, it was just one of those really weird, and when you're a teenager as well, and you're coming to terms with who you are and boys and, all of that kind of stuff. It was just very difficult. So I hated college and I hated being at home and was really quite unhappy. And what happened then? So I decided I was going to leave college. So again, it was, what the hell am I going to do now? Because I still didn't have what will I do? So I wanted to work because I wanted to be independent. And so I went for and got a job at a local department store, which had a management training program. So you'd be paid while you were doing it, and you go around the different departments in the department store, and the idea was that you were training to be a manager of one of those departments. That was a proper job, so he was quite happy with that one. And it was due to start the following September. And this was, I don't know, the June or something. I thought, well, there's no point in me continuing at this college, which I hate. What will I do between now and then? And so there was a temporary role going at the local engineering services department where we would be walking around the roads and making notes of potholes, measuring the height of curbs, seeing what the state of the road was, seeing what the state of the pavement was. And it all went into an algorithm and you were trained to do it. And it was kind of full time. And I did this for about 3 months. And I really enjoyed it. It sounds the most boring job. But the reason I really enjoyed it was because I was a novelty. Because in this engineering department, so we're now talking 1978, there were no women apart from what they were then called telephonists, secretaries, typists. And I was in the engineering department. I was a woman. I say woman. I was an 18-year-old blonde teenage girl. So I was the novelty, and I quite liked being the novelty, and I was getting lots of positive attention. from the men around me, the other, the engineers. And it was quite nice being the novelty. People took notice of me in a positive way, and it was good. It fed my ego. And so a job came up there in the engineering services department where I could be a trainee civil engineer, and I would be paid. I would have a paid job, and then it's a bit like an apprenticeship. I would be going to college 1 day a week to get a qualification in civil engineering. And I thought, I quite like this because I loved the people I was working with. It was great. So I went for that job and got it. And I was absolutely flabbergasted that I got it as a woman because the odds against me were so great. But I don't know if I was like a token woman that they took on, because I don't know. Anyway, I got the job. And I actually did something that pleased my father, because this is a proper job. An engineer, this is a proper job. But I remember he used to drive me occasionally to work, on his way to work. And I would say, can you park round the corner? Because I dreaded anybody knowing where I lived or what my father did, or the fact that we were, by this time, relatively, in that area, relatively wealthy, because I would be ostracized again. And I didn't want that.
Uh-huh.
And he was furious about that, because he wanted me to be proud of the fact that he drove a Daimler and that he was managing director. If people said to me, what does your dad do? I'd say he works in a factory. I wouldn't say he's the managing director of the factory. And so he was hurt by that. And I get that. I get why he would be hurt by, because he worked hard to get there. He didn't have a privileged background particularly. He did work hard to get there, and I was kind of ashamed of it. And
you were trying to fit in.
I was trying to fit in. I just wanted to be one of the. It was already hard. I was the only woman, and the people I was working with largely lived in council houses. They lived locally, and I wanted to be, as much as I could, being the only blonde engineering technician, I wanted to fit in. Anyway, so I did get the job, and in the end, I didn't really enjoy it, but a few good things came out of it. So I learned what it was like to be a woman in a man's world. And although I enjoyed the novelty of being the kind of mascot for a while, it wasn't that long before I realized, but I'm never going to be taken seriously in this profession. Because even at college, I remember one of the, actually I'm overrunning the tale a little bit. While I was at the engineering services, a flat came up that was available to people who worked at engineering services. It was a council flat. It sounds lovely. It was on where the council tip is. So where all the refuse wagons came in and out. But to me, it was freedom. So this came up, and I went for it and got it. And I went to my mother and I said, and how cruel was I? I said to her, you might want to put up with him, but I don't have to. And it was like an escape. I can leave home. I can be independent. I can get away from this. And although he wasn't physically abusing me at that point or sexually abusing me, there was still a lot of put downs. Nothing I did was good enough. He would still fly off into a rage over who knows what that was completely unpredictable. And
it's psychological, isn't it?
It's horrible, yeah. And I lived in this stupid place where I couldn't get anywhere independently because there were no buses. I just felt isolated from life and stuck in this road I didn't feel I fitted in, and in this with this father that I, couldn't get far enough away from. So anyway, I moved into the flat, which was great. Met another engineer there, got engaged. It was all good. But I did realize this isn't actually what I want to do. It's fun as a novelty, but I really don't want to be a civil engineer. And I decided to go into social work, which is kind of, oh my God, you've let the whole of womankind down because you were a pioneer, a woman in a man's world, being breaking down all those barriers. And now you're going off to look after children, which is what women traditionally do. So I felt the burden of letting down the whole of womankind, but knowing that I had to do what felt right for me. So I worked.
Did anyone ever say that to you, or is that just what you were thinking?
There were women in the engineering services who were doing other jobs. There might have been secretaries or PAs or whatever they were called in those days. And they I think in not horrible ways, but they expressed their disappointment that their cheerleader was going, and that I had started to challenge some of the ways that people were spoken about. I remember one of the managers referring to his secretary as my little girl.
Ooh.
and saying, my little girl. I said, I'm trying to work out which of those words I find are the most offensive. And she said, what do you mean? What do you mean? She loves being called that. I said, she's a woman in her 40s. How is she your little girl? It doesn't make any sense. No, she's flattered by it. She likes it. And so I think the fact that I was making those waves was welcome. But then I left and looked after children. So I kind of let everybody down a bit. And I felt as though I'd done that a bit. And of course, social work wasn't a proper job.
Right.
So I'd left my proper job, which was probably the only thing he'd approved of in my entire life, and gone to look after children in children's homes. So, but I'd left home by then, so it was less relevant what he thought. And although I still carried a lot of that low self-esteem with me, because you can't just switch it off when you've had it all your formative years, I was able to intellectualize some of it and say, actually, he might not think this is the right job for me, but I think it's the right job for me. And, you know, I knew that a lot of his views weren't views that I shared. Some of them were, you know, as I say, he wasn't particularly racist and whatever. And he did want me to have a proper job. You know, I think I would have been in a sense more offended if he'd said, oh, you know, go off and be a whatever he saw as a stereotypical female role. The fact that he was pleased I was an engineer was a plus, really. But then obviously let all that go. So I ended up.
And what was it? Why did it feel like the right job for you? It was the same job your mum had?
No, I don't think it was that, because I remember when I was little saying to her, why did you work with children? I would always want to work with animals. I couldn't see the point of working with children. I think it was, I don't know. I think the thing I didn't like about engineering was that other than your colleagues, you didn't really do much. It wasn't a people. I love people. I'm an extrovert. I get my energy from people. I love interacting with people. And although I enjoyed the kind of what I then saw as flirtatious banter, and I now look back and think, actually, that was a bit sexist, I didn't have that interaction with people. It wasn't a people job. It was a thing job. And although it was an important job because people need to have highways that work for their cars, it wasn't something that turned me on. It wasn't something that lit my fire. Whereas that people interaction, you know, I was realizing I was a people person. The fact that I wanted to play in an orchestra rather than be a soloist was because I wanted to be part of that group that made that noise. And so I was that kind of people person. So I think it was about wanting to work with people, really, that drew me into that role. And I loved it. You know, I was there for a long time and I loved working with children, and I went on to do a qualification. I was quite ambitious. There weren't many in those days, because again, we're now talking late 70s, early 80s. Most house mothers, as we were known then, who worked in children's homes didn't have qualifications because it wasn't seen as a professional role, but it was beginning to change. And then we started being called residential social workers rather than house mothers or house parents, which reflected a slight change. And I wanted to, again, there was so much unfairness in this role, not just in terms of how society treats what we now call looked after children, but in those days, children in care, but also the unfairness that goes on within those institutions. And I wanted to be in a position where I could challenge that and influence that. And when I worked in my first children's home, I was 19. So the children were teenagers. Some of them were only 2 years younger than me. So it was, you know, was I one of them or was I one of the staff? But a lot of the staff were very young. So it was a very young staff group. But the people who ran that children's home were a couple, married couple. So the husband was the officer in charge, as they were then called, and she was the deputy officer in charge, and they were married. And they were horrible people. And unfortunately, as we know, you know, organizations like children's homes, schools, hospitals can attract people who want to make the world a better place, but they can also attract people who want power over vulnerable people. And this couple were a very inadequate pair of human beings in my estimation. And I think they were lured to this job by the thought of having that power over people who had no power. Maybe they felt powerless in their own lives. I'm not going to defend it because whatever the reason, it was indefensible. And they treated some of those kids really badly. I remember we had one of the young children whose name I won't mention, but she was 10, but she clearly had learning difficulties and probably functioned at the age of about 4. And the only member of her family that ever had anything to do with her was her uncle, who was also the council rat catcher, as it happens. And he was a bit unreliable. So sometimes he'd say, I'm going to come and see this girl on Sunday. And then he wouldn't turn up, and she'd be sitting there in a coat waiting for him to come and pick her up. And he didn't arrive. And this deputy officer in charge would say, oh, he's not coming for you. He doesn't love you. Nobody loves you. And I can remember thinking, what the hell? And, they were kids that she clearly had favourites. She was the evil one of the two. She would make the bullets for her rather inadequate husband to fire, but she clearly had favourites. And she bullied the kids that she didn't like. And it was just horrible. The way that place was run was horrible. And us youngsters that were there working under this couple, we'd say, this is horrific. This is awful. And so, again, I was the one that said, well, it's no good us just telling each other it's awful. We've got to do something about this. Nobody else would come with me, but I went to the management in the local social services office and said, I think you should know what's going on at this children's home, and I would give them examples. So, for example, this is an incident I witnessed. This is an incident I witnessed. It's not just me thinking this, that the rest of the staff there think this too. Unbeknownst to me, this manager that I'd gone to make this official complaint to was a mate of this couple. So actually all that happened was he went and told them, I should tell you what Jane's been saying about you. So I'd been applying to go on the one qualification that you could do as a residential social worker. And of course they blocked me because, and my life there was not great after that. So they would turn the kids against me and, whatever. I had unfair disciplinaries for things that were, made up. It was awful. So I left and I went to another children's home, and I went back to the managers in the social services, and I went above the person that I'd complained to. And I said, I'm not there now, so there are no consequences for me in telling you this. You need to know what's going on at this children's home. And so I really pushed it. I wasn't happy just to leave and let it carry on. So I really pushed it, and I said, you need to go, you talk to the children, talk to the people who live in that home, whose home it is, and see how they feel. And anyway, eventually, and it took a long time, they did break them up as a couple. They didn't discipline them or sack them, which is what they should have done. What they did was they gave him the job of officer in charge at another children's home in the borough. And she was given a really good reference. So she was the deputy in another borough at a different children's home. So they were still working in the field, unfortunately, but at least they'd been split up, and that children's home became it's closed down. So there was a lot of unfairness that I could see within the services as well as outside of social service. And I was very ignorant. I mean, I didn't know. We never did any training. That 3-year course that I did eventually get on to make me a qualified residential social worker, 3 years, we did 1 half day on what we called in those days equal opportunities. That was it. And they talked a bit about race and a bit about gender. But again, this was in the early 80s, so not much legislation around, a bit. And it was very much about legislation compliance rather than about anything we might talk about today, like unconscious bias. So I was very, very ignorant about equality and diversity and all of those things. But I was still angry. So I remember we had a young girl at one of the children's homes that I was working in. I think she was about 15, and she was mixed race. And I found her in the bathroom with a Brillo pad trying to get her skin off. I said, what on earth are you doing? And she said, I hate my skin. And I said, what do you mean? It's beautiful. It really was. I mean, she was stunning. What do you mean it's beautiful? And she said, white people don't like me because I'm too black, and black people don't like me because I'm too white. So I need to get rid of it. And I was so ill-equipped to deal with this. I'd never been a victim of racism, obviously, as a white person living in Britain. And I didn't really, I said stupid things like, we spend a fortune every year to go on holiday so our skin can become colour like yours. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful skin colour. But it's not if that skin colour means that you become a victim of racism or you're excluded from every group that you've got the opportunity to be in because of it. I just didn't understand. And I could see that, teenagers that left care were really badly treated. You're 18, right? We've got no responsibility for you now. You're out on your own. And if you've lived in a children's home for most of your life, you have no idea about families, about budgeting, about cooking. There was a cook at the children's home who cooked all the meals. It wasn't like when you're at home and you grow up and you watch your mom cook the meals or your dad cook the meals or whatever it might be. There was no preparation for independent living. And once you were 18, that was it. You're out on your own. No budgeting. No, you were given a flat, but that was it. And that was diabolical as well. I mean, obviously, we did as much as we could. And we said, oh, come round for Sunday lunch and bring your washing round and that kind of stuff. But there's a limit to what you can do. So I was very conscious of unfairness then. And in the meantime, I got married and I was pregnant. And I got married to a man who was, looking back, I don't think this was the decision at the time, but looking back, I got married to a man who was nothing like my father. I knew I wanted children. I knew I didn't want my children to go through anything like I had gone. So I think subconsciously, I don't remember consciously thinking that, but I was drawn to a man who was very even-tempered. He didn't have flashes of temper. He was very even-tempered. He was very, very predictable. He came from a family who were very loving. He had a sister. They both were adored by both of their parents. And so I thought, oh, if he's going to be that kind of father, that's the kind of father I want for my children.
It sounds safe.
So
it
was very safe.
Yeah.
It was very safe. And I was right in that assessment because he was very even-tempered. He never tried to change me in any way. He supported anything I wanted to do. He never told me that what I was doing wasn't good enough. If I said, I don't know, oh, I'd like to do this qualification. Yeah, go for it. And it was so refreshing to be living with a man that I didn't feel frightened of was lovely. It was just lovely. It was great. And so then we got pregnant and I was still working shifts in a children's home and recognized actually this isn't something I want to carry on doing when I've had my child, because I don't want to be paying someone to look after my child while I look after other people's children. Shift work really wasn't going to work. And I didn't know at that point what kind of a mother I was going to be, or indeed what kind of a father he was going to be. So how did that happen? When I was doing my qualification, there was a woman who was my study supervisor. And she was the link between what I was learning at college and what I was doing in practice I was 2 days a week in college, 3 days a week in the children's home or whatever, 3 shifts a week. And she was wonderful. I loved her. She was a great role model. She used to say, "You're so angry," because I used to rant about the things that were wrong with the system. Why is it that children in care are treated so badly? Why is it that we just abandon them at 18? And she said, but you use your anger very positively. Don't lose it, but make sure it doesn't destroy you. Use that anger in a very positive way. And I loved her. Anyway, she retired and that job came up. So I wasn't working after I had my first daughter, Alex. And then when she was about 18 months old, there was a leaving do for this woman. So I went to the leaving do and one of the managers there said, why don't you apply for the job? And I hadn't considered really working. I was very, very fortunate and privileged that my husband was earning enough for me not to need to work. It was a bit tight, but it was okay. But I just thought, oh God, wouldn't that be great? Because part of me thought I'm missing using my brain. I loved being a mother. I loved spending time with my daughter, but there was a bit missing that was kind of, I like being a mother, but I'm sure that there's other things I can do too. So I went for this job and got it and absolutely loved it. And then we were doing training on equality and diversity. There was the race awareness training courses, RAT as they were disaffectionately known. And, there were rudimentary, I think, looking back, but, the beginnings of that kind of education around what we still called equal opportunities, which absolutely lit I'd go on these courses. Oh my God, this is what I should have known all along. And not realize, and actually things are far worse than I thought they were. because I've not lived through racism personally. And, you know, I suppose even sexism to a certain extent I hadn't, because I got the job I wanted to get and all the rest of it. And that really, really excited me. And the whole thing about, oh my God, the world is even less fair than I thought it was. This is awful. We've got to do something about this. And it really kind of lit something in me. So when I got pregnant with my second daughter, didn't know she was a daughter, the second child, I went to my manager, who was managing me being this study supervisor, and said, you know, I want to come back to work after I've had this child. And he said, bad news. They're changing this qualification. There won't be a role as a study supervisor in the new qualification. The role that is the most similar to it would mean you'd have to be back in practice. And I didn't want to work shifts with 2 children.
Huh.
So I thought, what the hell am I going to do? And I'd done a lot around, by this point, equal opportunities, seeking out opportunities, shadowing other people, and all of the rest of it. And he said, why don't you set yourself up as a self-employed consultant? And I nearly fell off my chair laughing. I mean, the thought of setting up I'd always worked for the public sector. I was an engineer, then I was a social worker. I knew nothing about being anything other than a public sector worker. There wasn't a world outside of that. And I remember going home and saying to my husband, you'll never guess what he suggested. I mean, it's ridiculous. He suggested I should be a consultant and train social workers. And I thought he'd laugh with me, and he didn't. And he said, well, what kind of things would you be training people on? So, well, you know, I'd be training social workers on equal opportunities, but also maybe management. And, you know, because I was one of the very few qualified residential social workers, I will be able to do training courses. And he said, I think it's a brilliant idea. What? So anyway, he was really supportive. And so during my pregnancy with my second child, I did all the research and discovered what I needed to do and set up as self-employed consultant, which was absolutely out of the blue, nothing that I was prepared for, equipped to do, or anything. But he had faith in me, and actually, when he said it and started talking about it, I thought, I probably could do this, because there's still that low self-esteem that is, I'm not good enough to do this, and I'm not good enough to train other people. But I really enjoyed training, because I'd done a lot of training in this role, and I'd really enjoyed that. So I thought, actually, this maybe, and it would fit around having children, because if I was self-employed, I could decide how much or how little I wanted to work. And so I did. That's what I did. And it went relatively well. I mean, fairly slow, but it fairly quickly, I moved completely into the equal opportunities space and dropped the social work stuff. And again, my husband said, this isn't just about social work. This isn't needed everywhere. You don't just need to be training social workers in equal opportunities. Everybody needs to know this stuff. And of course, he was right. And then I spread out. So I was training other public sector departments, not just social services, you know, housing and leisure and all of that kind of stuff. And also some private companies as well, who were beginning to be a little bit interested, mostly in race awareness, which I would train with a Black co-trainer. Because what I'd found when I was learning was that I learned best if I could hear the lived experience, because I've not had that lived experience. What is it like to be a Black person living in a racist society? I don't know. I need to learn. But it was also good to have a white person who was on this journey too, that I could relate to. How would they learn what they had learned? How could we be good allies? How could we as white people make a difference in this awful situation? You know, 80s, it's still awful, but it was even worse then. In fact, I'm not sure we haven't gone backwards recently. And so I did a lot of, for years, that's what I did. I did that I moved into this kind of training consultancy all around what then was started to be called equality. So the terminology changes. It was around the Macpherson inquiry. So there was lots of emphasis on race at the time. And so there became more opportunities. And then I got contract doing some consultancy on sexual harassment in a council, where I was interviewing women, and, you know, and that was horrific, what you found out that women were enduring. And then look back on my own, you know, with a sort of hindsight on my own experiences in engineering services. And none of it was meant maliciously, but I was definitely the victim of sexism, even though it was just the way people were then. But you look back and think, yeah, I was never going to be an engineer. And it was really hard. And those women that did, those real pioneers, as opposed to me who gave up and did go on and be engineers, had a really hard time. And they really had to fight hard to be taken seriously as engineers. And they really were pioneers for others. And even now they still work in often, sexist environments and environments where, expectations are lower, or, they wouldn't get the promotion or the development opportunities that their male colleagues would get. So, and it was, obviously much worse then. So it became an absolute passion. And having gone from a number of situations of, what the hell am I going to do now? I can't be a musician. I'm not really happy being an engineer. I don't really want to be in social work anymore. This kind of floundering around, what the hell am I going to do next? I'd found what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in this space. I wanted to be in this equality. I wanted the world to be fairer, because there was absolutely no justification for why it wasn't. There was no justification for people of colour, black people, as we would have said then, having poorer housing, poorer experiences within, the law, the legal framework, having poorer outcomes in health services, poorer education. There was absolutely no justification for that. And same with girls and boys, and disability was kind of there on the periphery, but it was seen as much less important, which it still is actually, as race and gender.
Can you tell us about your current company? Evenbreak focuses on disability. Can you tell us about what led you to really focus in that area? As you say, it was not, and still is, lower down in terms of people's priorities. But talk about your own personal experience that led you there.
So I was very conscious of disability being another whole range of unfairness. I was a little bit frightened of it because I didn't know a lot about it. It's very broad. I didn't have lived experience. I wanted to learn. So I did some work with some of the disabled employee networks, with some of the council, because I was still doing a lot of public sector work with some of that, with them that I was working with. And I was learning a bit about it. And of course, if I was talking to managers or organizations about diversity, equality in its broadest sense, I would always talk about disability. If I was doing something specifically about disability, I would bring in someone with lived experience who was also a good trainer and, work with them. And one of the things that I recognized when I was talking about disability with employers was, and again, this is still in the 80s, is it? 80s, 90s now maybe, was that there was this, there was kind of a beginning to recognize that we need to do something about race, we need to do something about gender, but they were doing it in a very rudimentary and actually not very successful way. But disability really wasn't talked about much at all. And when I did bring disability into the conversation, employers would either kind of say, well, why would I want to employ a disabled person when there's so many non-disabled people out there, or able-bodied, as they then said, terminology changes. And that was really disappointing to hear, because when I was working with these disabled networks, I was seeing so much talent that wasn't being used. They were underemployed. They were employed, but they were underemployed. And the kind of vibe when I was talking to them was, I know, things aren't great, but we're just grateful to have a job. And I thought, you shouldn't just be grateful to have a job. You should have the same opportunities as anybody else. And I was angered, not just by the impact on disabled people, but by this whole waste of talent. It's not just bad for disabled people. It's bad for society that we've got this amazing pool of talent that just isn't able to use that talent. We're not able to benefit from it. And then other employers would say, actually, we get it. We understand that this is a pool of talent we're not tapping into, and we really should, but we don't know how, and disabled people don't apply. So I'm going to disabled people, still in my privilege of being non-disabled and not having, experienced any ableism, and said, why aren't you applying for jobs at those organizations that want your talent? And they said, because we don't know which is which. Every organization these days says we are an equal opportunities employer, we are an inclusive employer. But we know that for pretty much every job we go to, the minute they find out we have a disability, that's the point at which we're rejected. So why would we keep knocking our head against that brick wall? And I can remember thinking, that's just ridiculous. That's just awful. Why doesn't somebody do something about that? Like we do when we're enraged. Somebody should do something about that. And I didn't feel equipped, or it was out of my depth altogether. And then irony had one of these quirky twists of fate where I'd had a riding accident when I was 23, and I'd broken my back, which sounds really drastic, and it wasn't. It was just that one of the vertebrae split across. It didn't move. I was young, fit, healthy. They just said, lie flat for 6 weeks, it will heal. I lay flat for 6 weeks, it healed. And I'd had a lot of backache over the years, but everybody has backache over the years. So, you don't think much of it. I'd had 2 successful pregnancies, so there was nothing too badly wrong. But then I had a slip disc, which doesn't sound drastic, but was. And it turned out that all of my discs were damaged. And it must have been from this riding accident, that although the bone healed, the discs were damaged. And then the aging process of those discs was greatly accelerated. So I had degenerative discs, which were kind of what a 90-year-old would have had. And I was only, 40 or something. And so I had various surgeries. I was in denial. You speak to most disabled people who become disabled as adults, which most of disabled people do, 83% of us do. And it's like that bereavement cycle. So you go through a denial. I'm not disabled. This is going to get better. This is temporary. And so I had various surgeries, and I had one pretty major surgery which had gone not as well as it could. And I actually ended up in bed, not able to, I could walk very short distances, stand for a very short amount of time, and probably sit for no longer than a minute, so I couldn't sit to eat meals. I basically spent my life in bed. And I remember lying there feeling very sorry for myself, and also surprised at how I was reacting, because of everybody, I should have been the one that knew this wasn't the end of the world, because I had been telling employers for years, disabled people make great employees. They build resilience. They have skills that they've developed over being disabled. But all of a sudden, I was disabled, and all I could focus on was what I couldn't do. And I was a single mum by this time. I got divorced. I think my husband and I just kind of, drifted apart like people do. And I've got 2 daughters who were in the early mid-teens, who didn't need a mom to look after them, but they needed a mom, to drive them around everywhere and all the rest of it. And I can't be a mom. I can't drive them to the dance classes they have. I can't go to parents' evenings. I can't do this because so I spent a lot of time feeling very, very sorry for myself, but also thinking about actually this issue that I found so ridiculous, that disabled people can't find jobs because either employers don't want them, or even those employers who do want them don't know how to find them. We should do. I am one of those disabled people now. So, and nobody is doing anything about this. And disability still is at the bottom of the pile. And those issues that were the case when I discovered them still are the case. So in the meantime, I'd set up a normal, traditional company with shareholders that was a training and consultancy around diversity company. And so I decided, well, I've got the knowledge, I might be lying here in bed, but I know about, just going back a little bit, when I went into this consultancy thing, which was so new to me, I did more training. So I did a postgraduate thing, and then I did a master's degree. I wrote a chapter in an academic book about anti-racism in the public sector. And so I'd done a lot of self-development and learning. And I thought, that learning hasn't gone anywhere. That's still there. This problem is still here. I do now have lived experience. This is a bit up close and personal. And one of the shareholders from the previous business had said to me on one occasion, he'd said, I employ people who are really, really diverse in lots of ways, from different nationalities, speaking different languages. We've got women in traditional male roles. I don't think we employ any disabled people, or at least not people who say they're disabled. What can I do to attract disabled candidates? So in my kind of trainer mode, I wrote him a great big long list of about, 50 things that you can do to attract disabled candidates. And he said, this is great, but I don't have time to do all of this because this is only one part of the recruitment and it's a lot of work. He said, if only there was an organisation out there who could do this for us. And together, more him, to be fair, than me, we kind of came up with the idea of why not have a job board that is just for disabled people looking for new or better work, and just for those employers who saw us as a pool of talent rather than a source of problems. And he came up with the working title of Evenbreak. And we said, well, we'll use it as a working title since we think of something better. And actually we didn't, so it's still Evenbreak. And so I actually formed Evenbreak lying flat with a laptop suspended over me, and made the decision then, well, a number of decisions, but two of them. One was, this is not going to be your traditional shareholder profit-making business for a number of reasons. One was, I don't want to profit out of ableism because it's a horrible thing and I don't want to make money out of that. But also, in my previous business, the shareholders had been very influential in the direction of the business. And I didn't want Evenbreak to be run by what's going to make us the most money? How can we get lots of dividends for our shares? What's the exit strategy so we can sell the business and make lots of money? I didn't want that to be the driving force behind decisions that were made. I wanted it to be run by what's best for disabled people. So I decided it was going to be a not-for-profit. And this is in 2011. And social enterprises have been around for a bit, but I'd never heard of them. So I thought, I don't want to be a charity because that's giving out all, I'm saying to organizations, this is a whole pool of talent you should be employing because it's going to benefit your business. If I'm a charity, it makes our candidates look like charity cases, and they're not charity cases. And employing a disabled person isn't an act of charity. It's a really good business decision. So I couldn't be a charity. I didn't want to be a profit-making organization. And then I learned that there was this thing called a social enterprise, which means you operate as a business, you make money, you trade in the same way that any other business trades. But instead of the profit going to shareholders, it goes back into the business to support whatever the social impact is that you're trying to create. And so I decided it was going to be a social enterprise. And the other thing I decided was, because having been in this field of diversity and equality for so long, been to loads of conferences, I'd been to so many arenas where we had men talking to other men about what women need, or white people talking to other white people about what black people needed, or non-disabled people talking to... That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So I decided if ever we get big enough to employ people, then I want us to only employ disabled people, because I only have lived experience of my disability, but we need to have that internal intelligence. And so that's kind of how it started. And then it grew and grew and grew over the last 13 years. I got more mobile, which is great. It took me a long time. So just walking a little bit longer each day, sitting a little bit longer each day, just learning and using the water. So I used to do aqua aerobics in a pool that was down the road. But I think in terms of my recovery and Evenbreak's growth, the biggest catalyst of that was I moved to London.
From the Midlands, yeah.
I'd lived in this lovely house, suburban house, where I'd raised my two daughters as a single mum. My mother, who was disabled, so I learnt a lot from her, lived just over the road from me. I deliberately moved there after I got divorced. She lived in a 2-bedroom bungalow. So I'd been tied for all my life, really, to that area, because when I got married, my husband had a business in that area. Then my children went to school in that area. Then I was my mother's carer until I became disabled, and we both shared carers for a while, which was hilarious. But she died, and my children had left home, and one was living in London, one was living with her soon-to-be husband, now husband. And so I was in this 4-bedroom house on my own, rattling around, only using the bedroom and the kitchen, really, because I couldn't really use the other rooms. And thought it was ridiculous me living here. I need to move somewhere that's much more appropriate. And I was looking for places locally to live, because the thought of living anywhere else had never really happened. But I've now got a bit of asset, because I got my 4-bedroom detached house and I got my mother's 2-bedroom bungalow. So my youngest daughter that was living in London came and said, "Could you afford to live in London, Mom?" And everything just fell into place, because a lot of what I'd been doing with Evenbreak was in London. So I'd have a driver. I would lie flat in the car. The driver would bring me down to London to whatever meeting it was. I'd stand up in the meeting because I couldn't sit down. Then he'd drive me back to the Midlands and I would be in agony for 2 days because of the journey. And I thought, actually, if I lived in London, I could be so much more independent because I could stand on the buses or the tubes and I could get to places. So I ended up selling both properties, buying a flat in London where I still live. And it's central London, but a kind of less expensive part of central London. But I can get anywhere by cab or by tube or by buses very, very quickly. So it meant that I could go to events, I could go to face-to-face meetings with people. And I gradually got more mobile because I was doing more walking, more sitting, more standing every day. You know, I walk to the bus stop, stand on the bus, walk from the bus stop at the other end to wherever I was. And I just gradually got more mobile and in less pain. And also there was a pool where I live, so I can do a lot more aqua therapy there. And I saw different consultants, so different kind of drug regime in terms of painkillers. I had a consultant who said, don't use that back brace anymore because it's doing the job your muscles should be doing. You need to be developing those. So it was a whole perfect storm of things that came together and actually meant that I became much more mobile. But it also meant that Evenbreak grew because I could be at those events. I could go to face-to-face. This is long before the pandemic. You know, people didn't do meetings like over Zoom or over Teams. Yeah. You did face-to-face meetings because I found that so difficult to do from the Midlands when most of the people I wanted to talk to were in London. Now I could do those things. Yeah. And so I got more mobile and Evenbreak grew and we employ more and more disabled people. We became global because there isn't an Evenbreak in lots of other countries and the candidates were coming to us saying, can we come to England? And I was saying, well, you know, you shouldn't have to relocate just because you're disabled. We started offering training and consultancy. We started, during the pandemic, we started a resource for disabled people to find career resources, you know, career coaching and things like that were specifically there for disabled people because there wasn't much of that around. And so Evenbreak grew to fill those needs that weren't currently being met. And kind of then it was now, but it was transformational for me as a person because now I felt not like I was a burden on my kids because I couldn't do all the things that I wanted to do, or that I couldn't be a really good employee because I couldn't do all the things that I should be able to do. I felt that I was able to mobilize other people to make things happen. And I don't have many talents at all, but I think one of them is able to spot the talent in other people. And what I've done with Evenbreak is found other disabled people who've got skills I haven't got, so that we have all the skills we need in Evenbreak. And I wanted us to be a role model employer because we only employ disabled people. So we've got to get this right. And so things like flexible working, workplace adjustments, job carving, looking at job design in different ways, we've taught ourselves, we've learned what works and what doesn't work over the years. And so we've got to today where we have, I think, 23 employees, all of whom have different barriers that they face and which I learn from every day. We learn from each other every day, and we help organizations become more inclusive and accessible. We help candidates navigate around those barriers that they face. And it's great. And I'm able to travel, which I couldn't barely get downstairs for a number of years, but now I can. My youngest daughter lives in Australia and I'm going over to see her again for the second time shortly. So my life has absolutely changed. And I'm not here to say, don't worry, disabled people, you'll get better, because most don't. And I shouldn't have done. Mine's a degenerative condition. I'm just lucky that I was able to do things that made me able to be more mobile. I still have a lot of pain. I still have a lot of symptoms, but I'm able to live life in a much more full way than I was, 10 years ago, maybe, before I moved to London.
What's next? What's next for you? What's next for Evenbreak? Looking forward.
I have incredible ambitions, and they won't be realised in my lifetime. Our mission is to create a world where Evenbreak doesn't need to exist. So we don't need specialist job boards for disabled people, because every recruiter will look at talent on its merits and won't have this bias about skin colour or ethnicity or disability or gender or whatever it might be. That's not going to happen in my lifetime. I'm 64. But every step we make towards that means that more disabled people get more opportunities, that we're reducing some of those barriers, that we're helping. So doing that globally is it's a massive ambition. But it's really about us being seen as the place to go to until people don't need a place to go to. So that we have the expertise within. We do a lot of partnership working as well. So working in partnership with lived experience organizations in Australia and Malaysia and USA and Singapore, wherever, so that every disabled person on the planet, if they can and if they want to work, have the same opportunity to as non-disabled people. So much more global work, much more influencing, much more changing the narrative around disability. Very, very exciting.
And just looking back, if you were to give some advice to your younger self, younger, any age, what would you say to younger Jane?
I think that one of the things my mother said a lot was things never stay the same. And what she meant was if things are really bad, they won't always stay bad. But if things are really good, they won't always stay good. They never stay the same. And I think if I could have learnt that earlier, that would have been better. So when I was growing up, I had no escape. Obviously, until you're 18-ish, it's really difficult to become independent from your parents without, and I didn't tell a soul about some of the abuse until after my mother died, because I didn't want her to know about, I didn't know if she did know, but I assumed she didn't and didn't want to have that conversation because it would have crucified her. So, but if I could have said to myself at a young age, this isn't your fault. This is about him, not about you. I learned that intellectually later on, but it's almost a bit too late because the feelings are still there, even though the brain challenges it. If I could have said to myself at 5, this isn't your fault. This is about his inadequacy. Maybe he can't help the way he is, but don't let it affect how you feel about yourself. And when I was really unhappy at college doing business studies and really unhappy at home, that would come to an end. That wouldn't be forever. Mm-hmm. And when my marriage was unhappy, things can change. And biggest of all, when I was in a really, really low period of depression, when I first learnt that I wasn't going to get better. And in fact, it was going to get worse. I couldn't deal with that at all. And I thought, it is impossible to live like this. It just can't be done. If I could have seen how I am now, but of course, there was no way I could have known that. But things do change. And even, it's weird that depression was before I had that really major surgery that made me much, much worse. Mm-hmm. But I didn't have that depression, even though I was much worse. The depression, that awful, crushing feeling. I was upset, I was sad, I was angry, but I wasn't depressed. And there's a difference, isn't there? And I think it was because I knew I'd learnt to live with the way things were. I didn't like it. I wish it wasn't the way it was, but I had learnt to live with being in pain. I had learnt to live with not being able to do things the way other people could. If you'd have said to me, even 3 years before that, you'll learn to live with this, I would have said it's absolutely impossible. Nobody could. And you do, you learn to live with it. It doesn't mean you like it, doesn't mean you embrace it, but things do change. And so I think what I would say, if I could have said to myself, this is horrible at the moment, but it will change, as well as the really, really good times, relish every moment, because this isn't going to be forever. I know now I'm able to travel. I'm trying to travel as much as I can, because at any moment things could change. There could be another global pandemic. My disability could suddenly get worse again. I could, who knows what happens in the future. So I've learned to grab every moment and relish it, really. And even little tiny things now. And I think I'm a very chirpy, cheerful, optimistic person generally. And I think that's because I've learned to really enjoy all the good bits, whether it's an amazing thing like going to Sydney and seeing my daughter and standing on Bondi Beach when I couldn't even get downstairs in my own house, or it's just something little like the sun coming through the clouds on a cloudy day, or the bus turning up on time, or something that's little that we don't even notice. I focus deliberately on those things now, and it's made me a much better, happier person than I was. And I can honestly say I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life. I still have pain. I still have symptoms I wish I hadn't got. I still have nights I just can't sleep because of the pain, days I struggle to function. There are lots of things I would change if I could, but actually overall, I'm much happier than I was even before I became disabled. So I think things change and you learn to adapt and cope.
Now, I know you've written a couple of books yourself, so just
yes.
let's get that out there. What are the names of your books? Tell me.
Yeah, I mean, they're not academic
tomes.
tomes. They're sort of conversational. The
nor
one,
is mine.
you'll tell from the title. So the first one is A Dozen Brilliant Reasons to Employ Disabled People. And that was because employers were saying, oh, poor things, we ought to give them a chance. And I was saying, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's about talent. And so I thought, let's get all that in a book. And then the second one is A Dozen Great Ways to Recruit Disabled People. So it's okay, now we've persuaded you that disabled people are a great source of talent. What do you need to do in order to attract and recruit and retain them? So that the second one is that one. So yeah,
well, I will put links.
I don't sell them. I just use them as kind of educational tools.
Okay, perfect. And what would be a book other than your own that you would recommend?
Yeah, I love learning from other people's lived experience because I think it's so powerful. And so one of the, I mean, many people read this book, but the Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, Rennie Edo-Lodge, I was lucky enough to meet her at an event. She was talking about the book and what had happened since. And for me, it's a must read. Every white person, every person. It's shocking, but it's also really enlightening and really does make you think. So that's a really good one. There's another one that's Trevor Noah, who is kind of a comedian, but he wrote a book called Born a Crime because he was born mixed race in South Africa and it was illegal at that point to black and white to have relationships. So just by the virtue of being a mixed race child, he was a crime. And that's an interesting read. And then there's another one, again, it's about race, which is No, You Can't Touch My Hair.
Yeah.
And that's by Phoebe Robinson. And that's really great, again, about the experience of being black, being a black woman, and the experiences you have that I'm never going to have. Nobody comments on my hairstyle and says it's a political statement. You know, I just try and find a style that suits me, that's easy to deal with because I'm lazy. But for a black woman, do you have it natural? If you have it straightened, are you, there's a political statement about whatever you do with your hair. And learning all of that is, I think, really valuable just to get an insight into what lives are like that aren't like mine. And any books like that I find just fascinating to read.
And my final question is, do you have a tagline or a title for your story?
I've been thinking about this. I don't know. One of it is about, a child stamping their foot and saying it's not fair, ! Which I have a 6-year-old granddaughter and she does that sometimes because she's going to be a strong woman like her mother and her aunt and her grandmother and her great grandmother. So there's the kind of, it's not fair, but also there's a kind of, what the hell am I going to do now? Theme that kind of things change that are out of my control. And there's been that kind of, what the hell am I going to do now? But then it always seems to work out somehow. So I don't know whether it would either be, it's me stamping my foot saying it's not fair, or whether it would be me saying, now what?
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I will choose one of those because that will become the title of the podcast episode. Jane, thank you so much. I literally have been sat here thinking you really should write your autobiography because I think people would love it. I think it would be a bestseller. You're wrinkling your nose and
yeah. I don't suppose anybody thinks their own story is particularly interesting because you've lived it, so it's kind of what you know, and it doesn't feel remarkable in any way. And there are so many, autobiographies out there, a lot of which I've read and enjoyed. But anyway, I don't have the time. I'm too busy dominating the world and trying to get everybody to
too busy saving the world. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm sure the listeners are going to be really, really intrigued by your story. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. It's given me lots to think about too.
This podcast is brought to you by Liberare Consulting, with editing provided by Hawkins Social. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not click on the subscribe button so you are the first to hear about new episodes. We look forward to welcoming you back soon.